Hey guys, so I'm back with another .NET MAUI video, and in this video we are going to see how can we detect the screen orientation and how can we set it programmatically. Okay, so currently it is in portrait mode, and if we tilt it down, so now it is in landscape mode. So we are going to see how can we set the orientation, how can we get the orientation, and how can we detect the change in orientation. So if it is changing, how can we add our own logic, so whenever our screen uh, orientation changes from landscape to portrait or portrait to landscape, so all these things we are going to see in this video. So I have simply created a new .NET MAUI 6 project using .NET 6, and I have simply ran it. And so without wasting any time, let's get started. So first thing, maybe let me change some title, device orientation. Okay, so first thing, we have one device API for this. So in order to get that, we need to work on the C# side. So we have device display API, device display dot current dot, we have main display info, and then we have orientation here, which is of type display orientation and which has this portrait, landscape, and unknown mode. So we are going to work for these two, portrait and landscape. Okay, so this way, as you can see, we can get the current orientation. So if let's say on click of this button, and so maybe first thing I'm going to display an alert, and title, its orientation, and the message would be this one, the toString maybe, and then the third one. Okay, and now let me copy this over to this method as well, and let's rerun it. So you can see it's in portrait mode. If I click on this again, it's in portrait mode. Now I changed it. Now if I click on this, it's giving me landscape. And if I'll change it again, click on it, so portrait. So this is how we can get the current orientation. So if you have seen my previous video, I explained we can use this approach, device display dot current, but as you can see, this device display current, so this current, this actually implements this I, it is of type I device display, this interface, right? So if we want to introduce unit test, then what we should do, we should register it here, builder.services dot add maybe singleton, in this case I device display, and then we can provide the implementation. So it will be device display dot current. So using this, then we can inject this directly into our constructor, and then we can use it like this. So using this, we don't need to use this directly, and we can so for UI it could work, but if we are doing all this logic in maybe some model class, some service class, or some, if we are implementing MVVM, then if we are using this in some view model or any code behind, not this view code behind, so it would be better approach to use this dependency injection so that we can provide mock implementation for this, and then we can get it. Because if we directly use device display dot current, this does not exist in test environment, right? When we run our unit tests, so those are not running against Android, iOS, or Windows. Those are simply running in their own test context, so there it does not exist. So in order to mock this, we should use this approach. So in this, I'm going to use this device display dot current only. So let me revert these changes from here and from here as well. So getting part is straightforward. We can directly get it. We have this cross-platform API. We can use this. Now, if we want to force our app to some specific orientation, we can do that. So we are working on Android. So let's go to Android. What we can do from main activity. So we have couple of approaches. So first thing, what we can do, this activity attribute. If you look into this, we have this screen orientation, this property, right? So it, we can enforce that orientation using this property of that activity attribute. So what we can say, yeah, maybe let me break it down. So we can have screen orientation and screen orientation dot landscape, or screen orientation dot portrait. So we have all these options. So let's see, if we edit landscape now, if we run it, so our app, this will be displayed, this will be start in landscape mode, because we set this landscape mode on the activity itself, the main activity. Let's wait and let's see how is it behaving. Yep, so you see it's in landscape mode. So its counterpart for iOS, what we can do, if we want to enforce this, we can go to iOS and we can add it to info.plist. So I actually don't have, I am using Windows and I don't have iPhone, so I cannot show you the iOS version, but you can play around with it. Okay, so this is one approach. Then the another approach we can take, we can override on create method, and here we have the requested orientation property, and we can set screen orientation dot, all these options we can set it from here also. So this attribute and this thing, these are same, so we can use either of these. Do we have some other screen orientation? Okay, we'll go here, let me check. We have this requested orientation, turns the requested of the activity or change the desired. Yep, we can get and we can set using this. Okay, fine. So now let's rerun it. Now I have commented out this attribute label and I have added this. So let's see if it works. So it came and it again, it is showing portrait and it is actually in orient landscape mode. So let me check. Okay, that means this on create overridden method, this executes later, and we have added this here, right? So the flow, how it works, you can add breakpoints to check how all these things are working. So when we run Android, how it works, first it goes to this main application. From here it calls this MAUI program dot create MAUI app, this one. Then from here it goes to app, then it goes to main activity, then it goes to our main page, and from after main page constructor then it calls this on create. So this we are setting it later, that's why it shows uh, where is it, yeah. So because we were using it inside constructor, that's why it displayed that it is in portrait mode, because the default mode is portrait. So and you can simply figure out that this approach, the attribute level approach, this is a better approach to enforce certain screen orientation. This better would be the better approach. Okay, so all these things we can get the, so this enforces this orientation to the, we can say, startup. But what if we have maybe some button or some setting, on click of that we are changing the orientation of this device? And second thing, maybe for now let's comment out both of these and let's go to main page. And what if we uh, want to detect whenever the device orientation changes? Maybe we, if we have physical device, we are moving that from portrait to landscape, or from landscape to portrait. So all these things if we are doing, if we are changing, then we want to do some logic. And on emulator side, maybe if we are switching this, the orientation, then maybe we want to do something. So for these we want to detect the device orientation change, right? So for that, what we can do, on this device display dot current, what we can have, so if we look closely, we have this main display info changed event. So we can add one event listener to this. So we have this event listener. Now this device display info changed event arguments, and it has this display info, and from display info we can get the orientation. Okay, so what we can do, maybe for now, let's simply show some alert, maybe the current orientation, maybe let it be orientation only, and we are going to get this. Let's change to current orientation, and we can have this thing. We don't need toString now. And yes, so now we have this event handler. So we are actually subscribing to this event. So this is going to be fired whenever there is any change in display info. So display, it is actually going to trigger if we are changing the size or if we are changing the orientation. So let's see if it works. It came, and if we click on it, it's in portrait mode. If we changed it, current orientation, landscape. So this current orientation, this actually comes from here only, right? Because we changed the orientation, it detected it and it displays this alert. So if we want to add a breakpoint, let's change it again. So it came here again, and now this time it is again going to show us the value that current orientation is portrait. So we can inject our own logic whenever there is any change in the orientation. Okay, so all these things, this is actually physically changing the device. If we have some device and we are changing its orientation, or on emulator we are physically changing it from external side. Now what if we have some requirement and we have some maybe in app logic, so we want to change the orientation dynamically, basically what I'm trying to say. So if we want to change the orientation dynamically, this let me stop it, and this thing device display dot current, if we go to this current, so on this we have only these three things: keep screen on, main display info, and one event which gets fired whenever there is any change in display info. And in display info, this struct, we have height, width, density, orientation, rotation, refresh rate, all these, and these are constructor, and we do not have anything else. So these are cross-platform API, so we don't have any control over the screen rotation. If we want to change the screen rotation cross-platform API, using cross-platform APIs, we don't have that feature, but we can use platform code to change the device orientation. So for Android we can add our logic in Android, for iOS we can add our iOS specific logic. So in order to do that, let's go maybe let's create a folder, or maybe for now let's direct create a class, maybe uh, device orientation service, maybe device orientation service. Okay, so this thing, what we are going to do, we are going to have this public orientation service. The next thing, we will have a partial method, public partial void set device orientation, and in this we are going to have the display orientation, and we don't need this public, and this class must be partial. Yeah, so we have this device orientation service and we are using this set device orientation. Now maybe on the main page, let's add one more button, and let's call it change orientation, and I'm going to add a event listener on this one. Let's go here, and now what I can do, maybe let's have this as a private read-only parameter. So maybe in real scenario you want to inject it, you can register this inside the MAUI program, then you can inject it. For now I am simply using it like this only, and then on this button click, I am going to set device orientation service, device orientation service, device orientation service dot is a device oriented service. Is it not detecting it? It is detecting it. Do I need to add public? Right. And this is directly read only device orientation service dot is it true that specific? Okay, maybe first I need to implement that properly. Okay, now we are here. So we have added this partial class, and now it does not have any implementation because the implementation depends on the platform. So we are going to implement this method two times, one for Android and once for iOS. So in Android, let's create a new class file and let's call it the same name, or we can call it device orientation service, or maybe Android device orientation service. This name does not matter. What matters? Two things. First, the namespace must be same, and the second thing, this class must be partial. And now we can implement this method. So we will say public void and this thing. What is it saying? Already defines a member called this one. Public partial class. So do we need to add partial here? What is the problem? Both partial must have identical access modifiers. What about this one? The device orientation already defines a member called set device orientation with the same parameter type. Not sure, do we need to add this public? No, we don't, right? Let me quickly check what is it. I'm just checking what I am missing here. So to invoke platform code, we have these two options: conditional compilation, then partial classes and methods. I'm trying to use this one. So it says define the cross-platform API. I have defined it. Public partial class device orientation service, public partial device orientation get orientation, public partial, right? So it should be like this only. So if I go here, it should be public partial class and public partial this thing only. It is not allowing me. Partial method is must have an implementation part because it has accessibility. Okay, and we are going to implement this, right? Then it says go to these things: device orientation service in Android, partial class and partial public partial method. Okay, so let's go back. So I need to write partial here. Yeah. Okay. So in order to set device orientation, I'm in Android, right? Android. So if we go here, we can check in Android. This is for getting the orientation, but we can get, there's no point of reinventing the wheel. We already get this orientation using the cross-platform API. We need to set it, right? So in order to set it, what we have activity state manager, and we can get the default activity state manager, and from default we have a method by which we can get the current activity. So let me hold the reference. So we can say current activity is this one. So if you look, this could be null, right? So we will check if current activity is not null, then we will simply say current activity dot, and we should have requested orientation, and we can set it to whatever orientation we got. But if you look, we have screen orientation. This is a different enum which comes from Android content PM namespace. Sorry. And what we are setting, this is display orientation. It comes from Microsoft MAUI devices display orientation. So we need to somehow map these. So maybe let me add a private static read only, maybe a read only dictionary, and it will have the display orientation is key and screen orientation is value. Call it Android display orientation map, and we will use new dictionary, the same thing. And okay, so we will set uh, device orientation dot, if it was landscape, so it should be mapped to screen orientation dot landscape, and if it's portrait it should be mapped with screen orientation dot portrait. Fine. So now we can simply check if this Android display orientation map dot try get value and display orientation, if we found this in our map, so we will set it to this thing. Fine, it should work now. Let me clean it up, and we got it working. And let's check if it working. So before that, let's go here. Now let's check device orientation service dot. We have set device orientation. Now maybe we want to check if it was in, so we kind of implement that toggle logic. Maybe if the orientation is landscape, on click of this button it will change to portrait, and if it was portrait, on click of this button it will change to landscape. So let's use this, apply a switch on it. Device display dot current dot means orientation, right? Switch, and then maybe if it was the type of this orientation, it was display orientation. So if the display orientation dot, if it was landscape, we will set it to display orientation dot portrait, and if it was portrait we will change it to landscape. Fine, let me remove this line, and it should It should be good to go. What's the problem? Switch, expect this. Only assignment, calling command, increment object can be used in a statement. Okay, because we are not returning anything from here. Okay, maybe let me change it to the traditional switch. Is it complaining because of the default case? No, not the portrait exception. Is it complaining about this thing? What? Okay, maybe let's simply change it to if this thing, then, or maybe let me apply traditional switch this thing, switch this thing, case if this was it, let's call it and break, and if this is the case, we can use this. So we can have multiple approaches to implement it. Maybe we are doing this thing, maybe we want to always set it to portrait if it is the display orientation was unknown, and maybe we can use if else here, and maybe we can simply have one variable for this orientation, and we can have this line only once here using that variable. So the implementation is up to you. I'm just showing you how you can do this. So I think everything is fine. We will click on that button, it will check current orientation, and if it is landscape, it is going to call this with portrait, and if it is portrait, then it is going to call this landscape. And in here we are getting the current activity. If it is not null, we are checking if this orientation exists in our map. If yes, then we are setting it. Okay, everything looks fine. Let's run it. Okay, it's up. We have change orientation, changed, change orientation, it again changed. Yep, so it is working, right? We are changing it to portrait now, landscape, again portrait. So this thing is working fine. Okay, so in Android it is working fine because we have added this Android specific platform logic. But in order to do this on iOS, let's do the same thing here. Let me stop it first. Create a new class and maybe call it iOS device orientation service. The name is up to you. You can call it device orientation service as well. We are here and we will copy the whole thing from here. Fine. Now the screen orientation, as you can see in this one, screen orientation comes from android.content.pm. That means it is Android specific. And for iOS, we need iOS specific thing. But before that, let me change the namespace also. So namespace must be this only. So namespace for all these partial classes must be same. Now, in order to do this for iOS, we have something called UI application. So right, so it is in UI kit dot UI application dot we have the shared application, and here we can set the orientation, right? Yes, status bar orientation. We can set this thing. Now if you look into it, it expects a parameter of type this UI interface orientation. So again, we don't have this from cross platform, we have display orientation, so we want to apply a map here, and maybe let's call it iOS. It should be the same, and this thing landscape portrait, and it is not detecting landscape because we have landscape left and right, these two on iOS, so maybe use this only. And yep, we should be good to go. Now the same thing we can do here. If this iOS map, if we have this value where maybe iOS orientation, so if we found this thing, we will simply set it, and it expects a second parameter animate, so let's add it true, clean it up, and yeah, so when it is going to run on iPhone or iOS emulator, it should pick up this thing. I am using Windows PC, so I cannot actually show it, so maybe you can try it and let me know in the comments if it worked or not. So I think that's pretty much it. We wanted to work with orientation, so let's go back, let's take a recap. So we are here, so we have this device display cross platform API provided by .NET MAUI. We can use this API to get the orientation of the device. So using device display dot current dot main display info dot orientation, it gives us the current orientation, whether it is portrait or landscape. Then we can set the orientation for Android. We have these two approaches. We can either have this activity attribute label screen orientation, and then we can set this inside this overriding on create, then we can set it, and we can set it inside the constructor also. So the place is up to you, wherever you want to set it you can set it, but the best approach, we can use this thing if you want to force our application to be run in landscape mode. The default is portrait always. And for iOS, you can play around with these device orientations in info.plist. So this was for forcing. Then we have this event main display info changed. So from here we can add our own logic to detect the orientation change. I tried this thing, so you can have this thing, then you can change, you can check if it was actually a orientation change or not. So maybe you can have one variable in which you will have the current orientation, then you will check if the new orientation is the same as the previous or not, because this device display info changed event arguments, it actually works for a couple of things. All these things, if any of these property changes, this is going to trigger this event, right? This is going to raise this event, but we need only orientation, so we can have our own logic. We will have one private variable here, then in this thing we will check if the e dot orientation it actually changed or not. If it changed, then we can add our own logic. And then we saw that how can we change the orientation programmatically, right? So I have added this one button here, and on click of this button I am trying to change this, toggle this orientation of this of the device. So if it was landscape, I am going to change it to portrait. If it was portrait, I'm going to change it to landscape. But in order to change the device orientation programmatically, we do not have any cross-platform API implementation for this one. So what we need to do, we need to have platform specific logic, and I have used this partial classes, partial method approach for this thing. I have created this device orientation partial class. I have created this partial method and I am implementing this, providing the body to this method inside this platform Android folder for Android. So we can get the current activity using this activity state manager.default.get current activity. It could be null, so I'm first checking it for null, and if it is not null, then I'm simply getting the Android specific orientation enum, and then I'm setting the current activity dot requested orientation to this new orientation. And for iOS, I have added one class file to this iOS folder, platform iOS, this iOS device orientation service, and same thing, I am applying the same logic, creating the partial method inside this partial class. And in order to set this, we have UI application dot shared application dot set status bar orientation method, and to this method I am setting iOS orientation. So the iOS specific orientation enum, UI interface orientation. So yes, I think that's pretty much it what I wanted to show you. I've shown you. So let me know in the comments if you like this video, if you want to point out something, and if you have some better approach or some different approaches to do this. So you saw we have couple of approaches, maybe someone else have some different approach to implement all this. So let's see, and subscribe my channel for more such content. So yeah, I'll be back with another .NET MAUI video. Bye.